game developers and publishers. But back in the 90s, I worked at a company called Perfect Entertainment, based in Norbury in London, who made the Discworld games. And the last one that they made, Discworld Noir, I was lead designer and scriptwriter on. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, for the most part. I'm also going to talk a little bit at the end about my most recent book, as a shameless plug, but I will try and seamlessly build it into the presentation. I'd like to thank Mark for inviting me to come and talk about Noir, because although I do a lot of speaking gigs, I do about half a dozen a year, I've never been asked to talk about this game. How many people here actually have played Discworld Noir? Alright, any hands went up, that's better than most of the audiences I present to, so alright, we're already on to a winner. So, here are some games that I scripted and designed. Discworld Noir, Ghostmaster, which was made in Oxford. If you haven't played it, it's available for nothing on Steam at the moment, and nobody who was involved in making it gets any of the money associated with the sales of it, so I'm not sure I can recommend it on that front, but it's still a great game. I would recommend taking a look at it. And Cult Heretic Kingdoms, an incredibly obscure Euro RPG. If you like incredibly obscure Euro RPGs, I suggest you try and find that. It's practically impossible to buy now. But I've also worked on other games, in fact, quite a lot of other games. In all, counting only computer games and not counting board games and RPGs, I reckon I've worked on about 38 games, including this little puppy here, Play With Fire, which I funded entirely on my own and had my entire creative vision and sold, I think, 100 copies. I think I lost all of the money that I put into it. But it did get attached to a touring exhibition of art games and went around the world. So bizarrely, it has actually generated a lot of positive PR. So retroactively, I like to pretend it was a PR exercise and not an incredibly failed production. What I'm going to talk about today is this company, which was my first job out of university, unless you count working in a bar. Perfect Entertainment. They were based in Norbury. They evolved out of this earlier company, TWG, Teeny Weeny Games, which was set up by this disreputable character here, Angela Sutherland. Angela had worked for Firebird and Rainbird, BT's companies, and had a small production role on the Magnetic Scrolls games, which I loved. Guild of Thieves is one of my favourite adventures of all time. And she set up this company on the back of an interesting games from her friendship with this character here, who is Sandy White, who was the programmer of Ant Attack on the ZX Spectrum, the first true isometric game, and the first game to offer a gender choice of character, which Angela was the person who suggested offering a choice of character in that game. This is a very bad quality photo because it used to be up on the internet and then got taken down, I think, because Angela and Sandy are quite embarrassed by it, but I managed to pilfer it out of some archive somewhere. And this is an incredibly flattering picture which I took myself at a launch party for the first Discworld game. Is Colin Fuage, who Angela was married to and was the big stick inside Perfect Entertainment, the person who ran around and played the bad cop to Angela's good cop. And the guy in the middle, Paul Mitchell, didn't actually work on Noir, but he was the first employee of Teeny Weeny Games, and he kind of established what I can only describe as the drinking culture at Perfect Entertainment. Paul's Australian, he's gone back to Australia now, and he had this policy which was, as long as the work that needs to be done has been done, you have a duty to be in the pub drinking. And that was pretty much how Perfect worked. You did everything that could be done, and then you all went down to the pub and you got sloshed. And I got very sloshed working at Perfect. In fact, at one point, I woke up a little bit shaky and thought, how much am I drinking? Totted it up and realised I'd had 100 units of alcohol. I'd had 50 pints of Guinness in that week. And I realised I probably should be cutting down on that. I also gained a lot of weight while I was working there, and I think the Guinness may have had something to do with that. Now, after doing some Saturn ports, Angela got interested in the idea of doing some adventure games, because point and clicks were on the rise in the early 90s. So she partnered with this guy, Greg Barnett. That's a picture of Greg from the mid-80s. It's about the time that Way of the Exploding Fist 2 was coming out. I think it's a picture from Zap magazine while he was promoting it. Greg was involved in the Commodore 64 port of The Hobbit. He created Hungry Horace and Horace Goes Skiing, and he created Way of the Exploding Fist, which, people here play Way of the Exploding Fist? Yes, excellent. glad to see some people with some history. And he was working in Australia on the Shadowrun RPG, which he kept telling everybody was too big a project and they couldn't possibly deliver on the budget that they had. And then Angela offered him a job over in London and he sort of ran out on it and left it to Paul Kidd to finish off the project. So that's how Greg ended up working at Perfect. And when I joined Perfect, let me go back to Perfect as a whole, where are we? When I first joined Perfect, I had an interview with Angela and Greg, and Greg was not enormously keen on hiring me because I think he feared that Angela's intent was to hire someone to replace him, which I could never possibly have done at that point. So I was off in a world of my own, pursuing my own wild ideas. And it took quite a while for Greg to warm up to the idea that I could help him deliver his games faster. And as a result, when I first joined Perfect, my very first working duty was to do with the goldfish. Specifically, we had a bad case of fin rot, and it was my duty to take the dead goldfish every morning and flush them down the toilet. And for about 30 days, this was my only stated job duty at Perfect Entertainment. And then eventually, Greg did warm up to the idea, possibly because Colin or Angela gave him a big shouting to, that I might actually be more useful doing something productive. And so I was set to work on playing through the first Discworld game, which was finished and shipped at that point. And so my second duty was to play through Discworld. Not the worst of job tasks, although it is, as anyone who's played it will know, a bastard of an adventure game with very, very tough puzzles, and it was not actually that easy to play it through. And Greg would come in and sit next to me and talk to me about the puzzles and take a perverse pleasure in the bits that I was getting stuck on in a way that only puzzle designers can manage to do. And then I finally got to actually get some experience working on Discworld 2, which was in production at the time. Paul Kidd, who I mentioned before from Shadowrun, was working on the script, and Greg had done the design. And I was just in an assistant role, really, just helping everything along and learning the ropes. And then as that was tying up, there's a question about what they're going to do next. And the story goes that Terry didn't want to do another story with Rincewind. He'd stopped writing about Rincewind in the books, and he felt that Discworld was bigger than just Rincewind, and so he didn't want to do another game using Rincewind. So there was a lot of talk about what another game would be about. And one of my jobs during the period when I was working on Discworld 2 was to read all of the Discworld novels that were out at the time as preparation for doing it. And I think that is literally all the books that I read in the space of about 6 months to prepare for what was going to come. And I was struck by a character from Pyramids, Tepek, the assassin, who I thought, what a great character for a video game. So I came up with a design and a narrative design and all these details, and I did a poll of Discworld fans to prove that Tepek was a popular character, but nothing came of it because neither Terry nor Greg were interested in using the character. Greg didn't want to use him because he had another idea, which I think from what you saw in Discworld Noir, you can probably guess what the idea was. And Terry had no intention of ever returning to this character and really just wanted to leave him in Pyramids. But both Terry and Greg had a love for the old pulp private eye stories like Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep or the Dashiell Hammett's Maltese Falcon. And I spent, while I was reading the Discworld stuff, I was also reading these books and also looking at the film adaptations, almost all of which star Humphrey Bogart in some role or another. So there's that film adaptation of The Big Sleep with Bogart and Bacall, and The Maltese Falcon with Bogart and some other characters we'll see in a moment. So these were influences that I was having to sort of slam together, but the Discworld setting is so beautifully flexible that you can pretty much throw whatever you like in there and make it work. So I was looking at particularly the characters in the film versions of these books. The books are great, by the way. The Dashiell Hammett, little less than the Chandler, but the Chandler books are beautifully constructed stories. They don't necessarily lend themselves to a game setting and very difficult to put directly into the Discworld setting, but the films had lots of stuff that was familiar by reference or by direct knowledge, and particularly this suite of character actors, some of which you see here. So Peter Lorre, who played these slimy, oily characters with this fantastic voice that I won't attempt to mimic because my voice skills are terrible, but characters like this, and Sidney Greenstreet with his overbearing nature, that's him playing, what's his name, Caspar Gutmann in The Maltese Falcon. And Lauren Bacall as the sultry female lead against Bogey. I mean, they ended up married in real life. The chemistry between them really comes out on screen. So Greg was very interested in getting some of this old film noir influence into a video game, and so the character designs really came off this. So the character of Luton, who is named after Val Luton, the horror director, for reasons that are apparent for anyone who knows the story of Discworld Noir, and I won't bother explaining here. Obviously, descending from the classic hard-boiled Private Eye, and then he's got characters like, this is Jasper Horst here, who is a straight rip-off of the Caspar Gutmann character from The Maltese Falcon, but turned into a giant obese troll. And all of the characters pretty much have this sort of lineage to something from the film noir roots. And that was the sort of source material out of which Discworld Noir grew. The artists put their own spin on everything. I at no point specified that Carlotta should have oversized novelty breasts, but the artist insisted that this was an important character trait that she had to have. What I was interested in doing, though, was exploring different ways of mounting the adventure game format. So in Discworld 2, they had this sort of classic chat bar whereby there were a set of topics, but you basically clicked on each of them in turn because you didn't know what was going to work, and so you did all of them. I wanted to try and do something more sophisticated. It's debatable whether I succeeded, but I had this idea to try and do as much as possible via a notebook, and the clues in the notebook would function the way an object would normally function in an adventure game. But what was supposed to make this work, and what is certainly an improvement from the earlier Discworld games, whether or not it actually pushed anything forward in adventure games as a whole is harder to judge. What I wanted to do here was be more useful in the error messages. So Discworld, the original Discworld, was particularly frustrating for players because there was only one error message: that doesn't work. And after you've heard that doesn't work 100 times, 1,000 times, you just want to smash the TV in. I really wanted to try and come up with an error message that would be more helpful to the player. So the way that the system works with the notebook in Noir, and with the inventory as well, because there are some objects, is that the characters in the game have sets of error messages that correspond to specific styles of information. So, for instance, if you have a topic that has something to do with trolls, and the character knows nothing about trolls, they will at least say in the dialogue that responds, I'm not a troll, I don't know anything about that, as a pointer to the player that they should be going and talking to trolls. And the idea is that all of these error messages would function as something of a funnel to the player to help guide them towards what they were supposed to be doing, which it more or less does do. But Greg being Greg and having his love for insane puzzles, every time I delivered these neat sets of puzzles that would guide the player neatly through the story space, Greg would come in with a more evil idea for how the puzzle should work, to the extent that I don't think anybody noticed that there was some nice funneling going on with the notebook, because everyone was more up in arms about whatever puzzle it was that they'd get stuck on. But to one extent, I did succeed in my goals with this game, because at the level of the story layout, the narrative design, this is an old diagram that is an approximate description of the threads for the first two acts of the game. I wanted to open it up a little bit, as much as I could get away with, so that the story would progress in a different way for different players, as much as was possible. Greg was open to me doing this on one condition. He didn't want any expensive materials to not be seen by players. So the rule was, cutscenes, which were expensive to render and required a lot of resources, were mandatory. The players had to see them at some point. Everything else, all the dialogue, all of the nuts and bolts in the corners, it didn't matter. And that gave me quite a bit of freedom. So this threaded structure, which I'm sort of implying it here, works such that these individual threads, represented by the vertical sections, are elements of the story which advance on their own in parallel to all the other threads. In fact, in the early stages of the game, it doesn't make too much of a difference because it's just opening up. But by the third act, when you're investigating the killings, all of the threads, the 7 threads for that act, are all independent and can advance at very different rates from one another. To the extent that when the game came out and the journalists were playing it, I'd chat with the journalists and find that they had all solved certain puzzles in different ways, sometimes in ways I didn't know were possible, because the threads worked in this parallel capacity, it was hard to tell as a player that something clever was going on under the hood, because you just got one story. And I think I perhaps created something that was massively excessive to the circumstances, because I think I was the only person who appreciated that anything interesting was going on there. You would have to have played the game several times to really appreciate it. But as a plus compared to other games that tried to be a little bit non-linear, unlike Blade Runner, which actually you couldn't complete most of the time because it was buggy as hell, this game you could at least complete most of the time because it was only slightly buggy as hell. So I think some progress of some kind was made. So, I wrote the script for Noir in about a month, working about 16 hours a day on my laptop at home. I don't know how much I was drinking during that time, I suspect quite a lot. And then after I finished writing the draft script, Terry took it away with him to Australia, where he was going on holiday, and legend has it that he edited it on Ayers Rock, which surely can't be true, because his laptop power supply could not possibly have lasted long enough to edit a 15,000 line script. But that's the legend of the Discworld Noir script, was that it was edited on Ayers Rock. Make of that what you will. And from the script, we went into our recording sessions, and I had just a fantastic voice cast for this one. I haven't worked with a better cast since, although I did get to work with Tom Baker on Heretic Kingdoms, which was absolutely awesome. But yes, I had, as you see here, Rob Brydon, who plays Luton, the main character, and voices a lot of the secondary characters as well, because he's got a lot of voices. Rob was not very well known in '98, when we were late '98 when we were doing the recording sessions. In fact, the project he was doing, he did another project during the voice recording sessions for Discworld Noir, which was a TV commercial for Kellogg's Choco Flakes. That's sort of a measure of where his career was at the time. Now he's much more well known. I'm pleased to say he's had a success of his own TV series, and also things like, is it Marion and Jeff that he's in? Yeah. And he's much more of a household name now, which is great, but of course I never see him now because he's out of my league. But he was lots of fun to work with, but also he was incredibly patient. The script, the recording script for the actors was automatically generated from the puzzle script that I'd written. And there was a slight oversight in the way that the program had done this, in that I had copied certain, well actually I don't know if I'd done it or whether or not the automatic processing had done it, but certainly every location had a number of tags that you can interact with, as with any adventure game, and every location had doors. And in keeping with this idea that there would be error messages for everything that would be helpful to the player, there were error messages for the doors. And the default error message, the message if there was nothing helpful that could be said, was sometimes a door is just a door. And owing to a mistake in the way that shooting script had been done, every location of the game produced this line in Rob's shooting script, to the point that I swear he almost came out of the recording booth and throttled me after about the 30th, 40th time he'd recorded this very same line over and over again. We only needed one of those lines anyway, so it was a bit embarrassing for me that came up over and over again. Kate Robbins, who did a lot of voices for Spitting Image and still does lots of impression stuff. In fact, gags would make the voice actors laugh the most. And Robert Llewellyn was the most fun because he laughed lots of times and lots of the gags. There's a line in Noir where Robert Llewellyn, as the butler, is talking about the library, and he says something like, if the library were if the knowledge of the library were a beast, it would be a great dragon. Sir, by the same token, would be a kebab on an ant's barbecue. And it so cracked up Robert Llewellyn that we actually had to take a 15-minute recess because he couldn't actually continue the recording session. And I wrote the line instead of Terry, so I scored big points for that one, and I was very, very happy indeed. So that takes us up to we're pretty much the end of the production process for Discworld Noir, because after that it was just tying up the loose ends. I don't have slides for what was going on there, but it wasn't going very well for various different reasons, and part of the reason it wasn't going very well is that adventure games, which had been very big near the beginning of the 90s, were not quite as big as they once were. So Noir eventually released in July 1999, which was at least 6 months later than it was supposed to come out. I think it was supposed to be It should have been coming out opposite Grim Fandango, which we weren't happy about hearing about since it also has Discworld Noir influences, and being a LucasArts project had, we think, 10 times our budget. So we were very annoyed at Grim Fandango, but in retrospect we shouldn't have been, because we were both victims of the same trends, because Grim Fandango didn't do very well either. In fact, Grim Fandango sold about 100,000 units. Noir sold about 50,000 units. Given that I think their budget was 10 times higher, that means in a return on investment, or rather loss on investment sense, we did much better than Grim Fandango. So that's a win for us. Although I'm still a little bitter that even though Grim Fandango came out in '98, in Europe the release dates were mostly in '99, and so we only won one Adventure of the Year award, when if they'd just counted the US release date, we could have won many more. Not that it made any difference, Perfect would have still gone under and the game would still have been a flop, but it would be nice to have a few more trophies to go with it. But as I put down here, there was a real sense that adventure games were no longer in the commercial space that they once were. They weren't big money makers. Metal Gear had come out in September of '98, Half-Life in November '98, and Ocarina of Time in November '98. 3D was really coming through huge. The publishers were not interested in doing point and clicks anymore, especially after Grim Fandango, which wasn't really a point and click, but obviously followed down that line. The publishers saw the numbers that Grim Fandango did, and they were not willing to bankroll any more adventures. In some respects, we were lucky that we shipped Noir at all, because it almost didn't come out. The games industry was just moving heavily into 3D. The PlayStation, in particular, had brought these early 3D home games out to a wider market, and they were just selling battery associated with this. Why did adventure games die? Now obviously this is an embarrassing thing to be talking to people who are probably all working on adventure games, but certainly from the point of view of the market in the late 90s, adventure games went from being a major commercial part of the games industry to being no part of the commercial games industry at all. And it's great that there's been a revival now, and obviously many of the circumstances that we have now in terms of being able to get stuff to market without having to go through publishers, for instance, have really allowed adventures to come back in. But I want to look into this question about why adventure games died, and I want to look at it through a particularly self-serving lens of the theme of my new book, Imaginary Games, which is a book of game philosophy. It's the first attempt to provide foundations for game aesthetics, basically. For the two people, one people, half a person in a room with an interest in the foundations of game aesthetics. I have two blogs. If you're only interested in game content, you want blog.ihadler.com. If you want to hear me ramble on some pretty obscure and random topics, then Only a Game.
Who says your favourite adventure generally, outside of the Discworld games?
Well, it'd be very self-serving of me to pick the Discworld games as a favourite anyway. As I said earlier, Guild of Thieves, the Magnetic Scrolls game Guild of Thieves, although I don't think it perhaps holds up as well against some of the newer stuff that's come down, which I think is narratively more interesting. I loved in Guild of Thieves that whereas earlier adventure games really had been pretty damn linear in the way that they were strung out, in Guild of Thieves it did have this thing whereby you had a final score based on the treasures you were able to steal, and almost all of those treasure stealing storylines were completely separate elements, and although there was a certain amount of the world that was opening up, it was totally left to you how you went about doing it. And I loved the illusion of agency that that game was able to deliver. I thought it was far and away my favourite of the Magnetic Scrolls games, and I think still is my favourite adventure. Anyone else?
You talked about how it's easy for people to not have to imagine, and
yes.
The way things have happened is that it started off with books, and then it's films where people don't have to imagine anything.
Yeah.
I think you'll get to a point where people in general will just be less creative because of this is the way things
No, I don't. If you look at the psychology behind it, there's a sort of a split of about 3 to 1 in this sort of preference towards what in Myers-Briggs is called sensing, versus what in Myers-Briggs is called intuitive, and what in five-factor model is called openness to experience. So there seems to be this sort of natural division into imaginative and less imaginative people, or geeks and squares, if you prefer. And because there's this sort of natural split in the population, I think although the mass market stuff has to pander to, you know, the wider audience, there's always this sort of guaranteed built-in audience of more imaginative, clever, geeky people. And I think there will always be more interesting stuff going on in that space if you are one of the imaginative people. So I don't think there's any risk of us sort of reaching an apocalyptic collapse of imagination. I think we will actually continue to progress in imagination even while the mass market stuff gets crasser and more obvious. And I think 3D movies might be the sort of epitome of that, as if we didn't get enough of those in the 50s.